We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
This is Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website, bookedonrock.com. Brian J. Kramp is our guest to talk about his brand new book, This Band Has No Past, How Cheap Trick Became Cheap Trick. This Band Has No Past was the first line of the farcical biography, printed on the inner sleeve of Cheap Trick's first album. But the band, of course, did have a past that straddles two very different decades. From the tumult of the 60s to the anticlimax of the 70s. From the British invasion to the record industry renaissance, with the band's debut album arriving in 1977, the year vinyl sales peaked. This Band Has No Past, featuring a foreword by Pearl Jam bassist Jeff Ament, tells the story of a bar band from the Midwest, the best and weirdest bar band in the Midwest, and how they doggedly pursued a most unlikely career in rock and roll. It traces every gnarly limb of the family tree of bands that culminated in Cheap Trick, then details how this unlikely foursome paid their dues with interest night after night, slogging it out everywhere from high schools to bars to bowling alleys to fans' backyards, before signing to Epic Records and releasing two brilliant albums 6 months apart. This Band Has No Past is packed full of new insights and information that fans of the band will devour. How was the Cheap Trick logo created? How did the checkerboard pattern come to be associated with the band? When did Rick Nielsen start wearing a ball cap 24/7? Who caught their mom and dad rolling on the couch? You gotta read This Band Has No Past to find out. We may even get an answer to some of those questions today with our guest, Brian J. Kramp. I also asked Brian a question that has nothing to do with Cheap Trick or rock and roll, but the paranormal. Here's what his bio says. Brian J., short for Brian James, hails from Waukesha, where he was raised in two houses, one across the street from a bowling alley, the other haunted. I put together a great playlist of Cheap Trick, including the songs we talk about in this episode, so just head over to the show notes page to give it a listen. Brian, how you doing, man? Great to have you on the podcast to talk about Cheap Trick.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me.
I have to ask you about something that's mentioned in your bio, which I just read to the listeners in the intro. You grew up in a house that was haunted, and there was a ghost named Douglas who would visit you. I love this. I'm a paranormal freak, so who isn't these days? But yeah, what's that about?
I've actually found some of the old newspaper articles. The family that lived in the house before us, they had a young boy who fell off the roof of a neighborhood building. Like there was like a quarry over there or something. It was like a big warehouse type building, and he fell off the roof because he was up there with some other kids. And I don't know, me and my brother and sister always felt something weird, would hear noises or whatever. But when we were older, my dad told us that one time he came out of his bedroom and there was a little boy standing there, like in the hallway. And he never told us about that when it happened. He told us about that when we were all growing up. And then we were like, we always thought there was something, you know? And it was because my dad was like, yeah, it was that little boy that lived in the house, the family before us.
He fell off the roof?
So,
is that what it was?
He fell off the roof of a building, of like a warehouse type building that was, you know, a few blocks away. But, you know, when I was writing my bio, so there's a bio on the inner sleeve of the first Cheap Trick album. It's written by Eric Van Loosbatter, who ended up becoming a pretty famous writer. And it's this fake bio of the band, right? So I emailed Eric like 5 times begging him to write me a fake bio because I wanted my fake bio on the book to then say it was by Eric Van Loosbatter, but I couldn't get him to do it. So I eventually tried to write my own that was kind of inspired by the Cheap Trick bio. So like, that's why it says Brian J, short for Brian James, because that's echoing how they to say Bunny's name in the bio. And so, you know, I talk about how I was in we also lived in a house that was across the street from Sunset Bowl the night when Jack Douglas came to see the band. And then, yeah, the ghost, the little boy's name was Douglas, and that kind of worked. And I was talking about the house I grew up in. So yeah, you know, I wanted the bio to have kind of that kind of feel of the Cheap Trick bio, and that just ended up being what I went with.
That's
just wanted
great.
it to be kind of weird and creative, so yeah.
This band has no past. That's in the title, and there's a connection there to Cheap Trick.
That's from the Eric Van Loosbader bio that I just referenced. That's the first line. So if you look at the inner sleeve of their first album, the one entire side is their logo, and the other side is this fake bio that Eric Van Loosbader wrote. And the first line of that is, "This band has no past." Couple reviewers have said I took that as like a challenge, which I kind of like that idea. I never really thought about it that way, but I like that concept of their bio says this band has no past, and I was like, oh yeah, well, here's your past, So
a hell of a past, and so many stories. Cheap Trick is a band not short on stories. You say you've run into many over the years who've had a great Cheap Trick story to tell you. So let's get into some of those stories now. In your book, you take us back to the origins of Cheap Trick, starting with where they end up forming. Guitarist Rick Nielsen's uncle owned a record shop in Rockford, Illinois.
His dad, actually.
Or his dad?
It was actually his dad, yeah.
Okay.
His parents, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So his dad puts his roots down there, and that's kind of the beginnings of Cheap Trick, right?
Yeah, because Rick's dad, also his parents were both singers and musicians. And yeah, they ended up moving to Rockford and buying this music store that already existed there. And it was called American Beauty Music House, and they just changed it to Ralph Nielsen Music House. And Rick basically grew up there, started working there when he was a teenager. But also, I think they bought that in 1956. By the time the Beatles and the British invasion hit and Rick Nielsen's a teenager, his parents own a music store. It's kind of like it's ground zero in terms of the Rockford music scene. And Rick was an only child, I think. So he's kind of got that only child personality. He didn't have any competition in terms of his parents or the music store or anything like that. And so yeah, I think obviously it plays an important role because he's just been surrounded by music his entire life. Plus he has access to all that. I mean, this is where his guitar collecting really kind of comes from. Is he used to use his dad's store as a way to track down people would bring in guitars, or he would find out about guitars and he would have guitars he could trade. So his access to guitars was also more than really anybody else had. And of course, we know how Rick Nielsen has become this insane guitar collector. His
collection is legendary. Yeah. And for those who've never been or know much about it, what kind of place is Rockford, Illinois to live in?
Well, back then it was the second biggest city in Illinois after Chicago, and it was just a big factory town, just lots of jobs, just a very middle class. But it was a big city, like most cities like that. It's kind of in disrepair now because all the jobs are gone. It's a very different city now, but back then in the 60s and 70s, it was really a booming city. So it was it was no Chicago, but it was a good place. And they spent a lot of time in Madison. There was this whole circuit of clubs that they could play that were within, driving distance of Rockford. So it was a pretty good home base.
It's amazing how many artists from the classic rock era will say it's seeing the Beatles that inspired them to become a musician. And you cite a statistic in the book that by the end of 1966, nearly 2/3 of all American males under the age of 23 had joined a rock and roll band. And that was true for the guys at Cheap Trick. 19-year-old guitarist Rick Nielsen was in the Grim Reapers. 17-year-old bassist Tom Peterson in the, is it the Boll Weevils? Is that how you pronounce that?
Yeah, the Boll Weevils.
16-year-old drummer Brad Carlson, soon to be famously known as Bunny Carlos, was in the Pagans. And then you have 14-year-old singer Robin Zander. He was in the Destinations. Can you talk about how Cheap Trick forms? Robin Zander wasn't the original singer, which is interesting, right?
Yeah, Randy Hogan, who actually went to high school with Robin Zander, and they were friends, and they had actually performed together in different kinds of bands. There was a band that when Cheap Trick were interviewed by Dan Rather a couple years ago, Robin talked about how he was in a band with Zeno and Zeno's sister. Then I asked Zeno about that, and he said, well, if you could call it a band. When they were young kids, it was like they had all these different permutations, different groups of people. I mean, that's one thing I really tried to pin down with the book, is all these different people that Rick Nielsen played with as he tried to find his way, put the band together that he was looking for, and it took him a long time, but eventually he has those four guys in 1974, and then that's the band. But the story they tell that I think is true, even though it sounds like a myth, is they really wanted Robin when they started what was going to be Cheap Trick. They really wanted Robin, but he had a contract for the summer to perform in the Wisconsin Dells. He had a duo called Xander and Kent. And so Robin actually said, you should call Randy, who Rick named Zeno. And then Zeno was their singer for like a year and a half. But really at that time was a transitional time. They were coming out of having a band called Sick Man of Europe, which was Rick, Tom, and Bunny with Stookie, the singer from Nas. And they played some of those Sick Man of Europe songs with Zeno, but you can tell this was really supposed to be, even though it was three of the same guys, it was really supposed to be a different band. Like Rick wanted to start something new, not just continue Sick Man of Europe. So when Zeno was in the band, they played mostly covers. Really, there were only 2 or 3 new songs that Rick seems to have written for that band during that time. It wasn't really until he had Robin that he just started writing songs like crazy. So you could kind of tell that Robin was a big inspiration for Rick, and just kind of freed him up, I think, because of Robin's range, which it took a while, I think, for Robin to figure out his range, because he hadn't ever really sung that kind of music. Like the duo he had was singing Crosby, Stills and Nash and Bee Gees and Neil Young and stuff like that. So I think for Robin to sing a song like the Ballad of Richard Speck, where he's just screaming at the top of his lungs, I'm not sure that's something Robin even really knew he could do until he did it. And so I think Robin and Rick both kind of figured out that Robin could sing anything. And then that meant Rick could write anything, from a soft, sweet melody to an insane screaming song. So, and then Rick, over the course of 75, 76, it seems like Rick wrote like 50 songs. So it was crazy. He really just started writing songs like mad.
Was it Robin Zanders? What's his nickname? Man of 1,000 Voices, or what's the nickname?
It seems like anything Rick threw at Robin could pull it off, which it must be, for a songwriter, must be an amazing resource to have, where you don't have to worry about, this is pushing it. With Robin Zander, you were never pushing it. It doesn't seem like so. But yeah, I think that really was important for Rick to be able to just write, whatever was in his head, write that melody, and then Robin was going to make it great.
Certainly, yeah, the vocals was not a challenge, but the job of frontman, that was a little difficult for Robin at first, which I didn't realize. I didn't know he was not too comfortable with that. That took a little. In fact, they were considering just keeping him in the band, but putting him in the background there and just play the acoustic and add some vocals.
Yeah, and you see, that would be the 3rd time that Rick Nielsen considered having a band with 2 singers. So there was a precedent for that. He actually had his first band, the Grim Reapers. There was a period of time where that band had 2 singers, Joe Sundberg and Gary Shooter. And then when Rick Nielsen teamed up with Tom Peterson, Tom Peterson had a band called Toast and Jam. And so Rick and Joe Sundberg from the Grim Reapers kind of joined Toast and Jam, and that's where Craig Myers and Chip Greenman were in that band too. And that became the band that ended up becoming Fuse, who actually had a record out with Epic in 1970. That band, when it first started, because Toast and Jam had a singer named Ron Holm, and Ron Holm told me he went to the first rehearsal and there were going to be 2 singers, Joe Sundberg and Ron Holm. But then Ron was in college, and Ron was like, I can't play music full time or I'm going to get drafted. I got to keep my college career on course, So Ron ended up just not going to the next rehearsal. But that's a second time where Rick is looking at having a band with 2 singers. So then when there's stories about this guy, George Faber from the Finchley Boys, with Rick asking him to join the band when Robin was already in it, it makes a lot of sense when you know that Rick had already done that a couple of times where he had 2 singers. It seems like a weird concept, but seems like something that Rick Nielsen considered multiple times. And you talk about Robin as a frontman. I mean, to this day, the real frontman of Cheap Trick is Rick Nielsen. Robin really doesn't have that flamboyant personality, which Rick has it in spades. So Robin has definitely developed his confidence and his stage presence and everything from the early days. But Robin was never going to be David Lee Roth.
Right.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, you're right about that. but he certainly became comfortable in his role as the lead singer, as we know, because he's been there for so long. Now, Zeno, you talked to him for the book. What is he up to these days?
Yeah, Zeno has maintained a career as a professional musician in Milwaukee. He ended up joining a band called Bad Boy, which that band actually had been called Crossfire, and that was a band that played all the same clubs as Cheap Trick at the same time in the mid-'70s. That band basically turned into Bad Boy, who had a few records out in the late 70s, early 80s. Zeno ended up, when he first left Cheap Trick, he moved to Minneapolis and joined a band called Straight Up, who at the time he went from Cheap Trick to Straight Up. Straight Up were paying him more, and they had like they put on a big theatrical show. And like I said, Cheap Trick were pretty much a cover band when Zeno was in the band. So it was actually a smart move at the time for Zeno to leave Cheap Trick, go join Straight Up. And he was in Minneapolis for a few years, ended up moving to Milwaukee. He is still kind of a fixture in Milwaukee. He performs solo and he performs with Bad Boy still to this day. And he's never had a day job. I'm really astonished sometimes when I talk to these guys who have managed to never have a job, like Pete Comita. You're like, how have these guys managed? But somehow they managed to pull it off and just make a living playing music, which of course is a dream come true if anyone can make a decent enough living playing music, Yeah, Zeno has managed to do it. He's a great guy too.
Yeah, it seems like he's really cool. Does he get along with does he still talk to the guys in the band?
Yeah, he'll go see them backstage and stuff. Yeah, there's no bad blood. They all get along. I think for somebody like Zeno, there's always this kind of underlying thing where I was in this band and then they became hugely successful, but would they have been successful with Zeno the way they were with Robin? I mean, you can't really, like George Faber, who we talked about, because he turned Rick down when Rick asked him to join the band, and then you're like, well, I turned it down, and then they became huge. But like George said, would we have been huge with me? Just because the four guys that ended up being successful doesn't mean if you change that up at all that it was going to have run the same course. So, but I think it's hard for somebody like those guys. It's got to be in the back of your mind where you were so close, but so far. Yeah.
What if, right?
Yeah.
As far as Robin, was it Bunny Carlos that played a big role in him getting the band? He's the one who saw Robin performing.
Yeah, Robin and Bunny actually played in a band together, another cover band that was called Friends with a PH. And also Brian Beebe, who, I said Robin had a duo called Xander and Kent. Well, Brian Beebe's middle name is Kent. So he was the other half of the Robin of the duo. And Brian Beebe was in that. Actually, Brian Beebe was the guy who met Bunny at Rock Valley College. And then they put this band together just because they could make some money. And they had Rick Pemberton and Russ Fryman in that band. I talked to both of those guys for the book. They were both around for a lot of the story because they were just part of the whole Ralph Nielsen music house scene, and just Russ Fryman could talk a lot about the Grim Reapers and the Pagans because he was in it. Russ Fryman and Rick Pemberton were both in a band with Bunny Carlos's brother in high school. So, there was a lot of kind of fringe characters who I talked to who were around for a lot of this stuff and kind of witnessed a lot of it and played a role to whatever extent.
That's what I love about this book. And it reminds me of, we were talking before we started recording, I'm a huge Van Halen guy, and it reminds me of Greg Renoff's book that he did on the early days of Van Halen and how he talked to so many people from those early days, from the backyard party days. And you talked to how many people for this book?
It's like 80 people, but, some people I talked to, maybe I got a tidbit of information, but they're not quoted in the book. Some people I talked to get like one quote in the book. There's different levels of how much input they actually had, the people I talked to, but you just have to talk to everyone because you never know who's going to have that tidbit of information. But yeah, Greg was a big inspiration. I actually had Greg on my podcast when he was still working on Van Halen Rising before the book was even finished, and have been friends with him for years. And my book is kind of Cheap Trick Rising. So he was definitely an inspiration.
Yeah, Van Halen Rising is Greg's book. Rock and or roll, right? That's your podcast.
Yeah, that's my podcast.
Get that plug in there. And and Bunny Carlson. Now the name, Brad Carlson was his real name. Where does he get this from? A Paul Bunyan book?
Yeah, he says that he liked Paul Bunyan when he was a kid, and maybe like his brothers started calling him Bunyan, and then other people would pick up on it. But he says the name Bunny, he credits Tom Peterson with starting to call him Bunny. And even you see there's an early ad for a Sammy G's show, and there's an early interview and stuff where it's written Bunny. You know, it took him, he was originally Bunny like that, and eventually, probably when the record was going to come out, when they were going to go international, that's when he came up with this Bun-E thing. You know, and Tom added the extra S to his name. They kind of played around with their names, I think probably right when they were looking at, you know, hitting the big time. But it goes back to this Paul Bunyan. He really loved this Paul Bunyan book or whatever, and his brothers started calling him Bunyan because of that. Yeah.
Well, now the name Cheap Trick, though, a little bit of mystery there, or there's various stories, right? The band's original singer, Zeno, who you mentioned, he's got his story as to where the name came from. Bunny, Tom Peterson, Rick Nielsen, they all have their own stories. What are their stories, and which one do you believe?
Yeah, Zeno is pretty adamant that he has a very clear memory of this. Bunny doesn't have a clear memory, but Bunny agrees with Zeno that they were just talking in Rick's parents' garage, you know, the first month or whatever that they had this band together, and somehow they landed on Cheap Trick. Bunny doesn't necessarily remember Zeno saying it the way Zeno remembers it, but their stories are pretty much in line with each other in terms of where and when and kind of how it came about. Tom Peterson loves to tell this story about how they were at a Slade concert, and he said that, you know, Slade were doing every Cheap Trick in the book or whatever, but Tom Peterson wasn't even in the band when they named the band. So his story definitely seems to be myth building. Although when I asked Bunny Carlos about it, Bunny was kind of like, yeah, Slade did do every Cheap Trick. And so Bunny didn't 100% disavow Tom's story. But the important piece of the puzzle was I found this one interview from some magazine called Super Rock from 78, where they ask him where the name came from. And Tom Peterson says, I don't know because I left, which is that's exactly right. He was out in Philadelphia. The reason he wasn't in Cheap, even though he played with Rick and Bunny, he played with Rick in Fuse, and then he played with Rick and Bunny in Sick Man of Europe. The reason he wasn't in Cheap Trick for the first few months is because when they moved back because they were out in Philadelphia for a couple of years, all Rick, Tom, and Bunny with Stookie, had Sick Man of Europe in Philly, and when they all moved back to Rockford, which was because Rick's wife was pregnant, they fired Stookie like immediately. And the band kind of fell apart, and Tom just went back to Philadelphia. Bunny said it was because of a girl. So Tom wasn't there when they formed Cheap Trick. He eventually, you know, moves back. They have Rick Shaluga was their bass player from like June to October or whatever. And then Tom moves back from Philly and joins the band. But yeah, he said in that interview, I don't know because I left. So he, like I said, he wasn't there when they named the band. And then Rick's stories are all obviously just Rick having fun with interviewers, saying that aliens named the band or they named it using a Ouija board, or all of his stories are just
that's classic Rick
having fun.
Yeah. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Tom Peterson was out of the band for a while there, early 80s, right through into the mid to late 80s. I forget what was the reason he was out of the band, because that's this book covers the early days. So this is after. What happened with Tom? Why did he have a falling out with one particular member? Or
I don't know the exact true story, because they definitely have never told the true story. But the story they tell is just that Tom left. You know, there's this idea he wanted. For example, there was a song called Machines Make Money that Tom wrote, and they actually recorded for All Shook Up, but they didn't want to put it on the album. And if you ever hear the song, you will understand why they didn't want to put it on the album. It's not very good, but Tom kept wanting to sing. Like, he wanted to sing voices. There was actually a point where he was maybe going to sing voices on Dream Police. They ended up talking him out of that, but he sings "I Know What I Want" on there. Also, there's a recording of the song "Next Position Please" they did for Dream Police where Tom is singing on that. But I think Robin and Rick I think all three of them like take different verses or something on that. But there was always this idea that Tom wanted to sing, which when you have Robin Zander in your band, I don't know why you're looking to sing, especially when Tom doesn't have a whole lot of range. But, they like to talk about how Tom wanted to do a solo album, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think, the real story seems to be something else, but I don't know the real story. Of course, there's also the Yoko element of Tom had his wife Dagmar. Fans like to sometimes blame Dagmar for Tom being out of the band. I don't think that really had anything to do with it either.
You're right about Robin's voice. That's like Don Felder, as much as he can't stand Don Henley and vice versa. Even Felder said there was one song, it was Hotel California maybe, where he was considering singing, and he's like, it's not going to happen. It's like, yeah. I can sing, but Don Henley can sing, and when you got Robin Zander there, yeah. Brian Kramp, Brian J. Kramp, right? We refer to you as Brian J. Kramp.
Yeah. There's actually there's a guy on the local news in Milwaukee named Brian Kramp, and even Zeno thought I was him. So that's one reason I have the Brian J. But my name on my podcast is BJ. That's what I go. Yeah. That's what I've gone by on the podcast.
Because I was trying to think as I was preparing for the interview. I want to mention your name, and I'm thinking it says Brian J. Kramp on the cover. We're going to go with that.
Yeah. Well, it makes me sound like a real author.
Exactly. Yeah, I always love that. The middle. That was one of my friends back in the day. We always used to laugh about that middle initial. It makes you very esteemed. The esteemed Brian J. Kramp. He's our guest to talk about his brand new book, This Band Has No Past, How Cheap Trick Became Cheap Trick, which is out now through Jawbone Press. As many know, Cheap Trick wasn't an overnight success. Their early days were rough. Can you talk about the band's early days with Zeno and how, according to Bunny, Tom Peterson would get the crowds pissed off just by the way he dressed?
Yeah, if you see the pictures, when Tom first joins the band, he starts wearing all this white makeup and frizzing his hair. Like I say, he actually looks like Frankenfurter for Rocky Horror Picture Show in some of those pictures. And yeah, in the Midwest, in these bars that they were playing, it didn't go over too well with some of the crowds. Zeno was pretty flashy too with his outfits. And Zeno was very lanky and a very glammy guy. Much more of a flamboyant kind of frontman than Robin was. So yeah, they, Bunny tells a story about they played in this place called Benton, Wisconsin, which was just this little town. I mean, they were literally playing next to a cornfield. Rick gets up on stage and goes, "Benton, is everybody here bent?" Which means, is everybody here gay? Which was not a good thing to say to that crowd. But he said they wanted to kill him. So yeah, they definitely had their run-ins with those Midwestern bar people and audiences who didn't really take too kindly necessarily to the flashy kind of feminine look that glam rock was all about.
And it did take a while for Cheap Trick to settle on that look, that image that we know of, that famous. You get the good-looking singer and the bassist too, with the cartoonist, guitarist, and drummer. Rock critic Ira Robbins remarked that they look as related as a Police lineup. And I love chapter 20 of the book. You list all of the various ways the media described the band members' appearances.
Yeah, as I was doing my research, because I went through all the old newspaper archives, old magazines, and I was picking up on this that, because Cheap Trick was such a fun band to write about, and all these music journalists were, they're writers, they're creative types, and then they had a lot of fun. And so you get every one of them found a different adjective-filled way to describe the band and especially Rick Nielsen. And so I just started making a list and adding to the list and adding to the list. And yeah, one of my earliest visions for the book was to have these lists of the way that the band and Rick Nielsen were described, because every writer had a different way that was, a lot of them were funny, and just interesting, and they all somehow found a different way to describe them. And yeah, I love those lists.
Here's
They're really
here's
fun.
Rick Nielsen's: unashamed jester, unabashed loon, consummate lunatic, quintessential klutz, screwball mastermind, extremely irritating, the record mirror, zany self-advertisement, LA Weekly. I mean, and this goes on for what, 2-3 pages.
Yeah, like 2.5 pages or something.
Yeah, here's one: looks and acts like a complete nut. Give Rick Nielsen back his Ritalin real quick, like.
And the descriptions of Bunny are even more insane.
Yeah,
like
let's
they're
see,
even
where is
more
that?
specific.
Nebraskan assistant minister whose church was just foreclosed. That's Rolling Stone. Bank teller in a 30s gangster film. Nervous accountant. Chain smoking accountant with a robust appetite. Taking a little shot at his weight there. Somewhat less bombastic looking Oliver Hardy. So you
And I end the list of Bunny descriptions with very normal. That was one.
Very normal. But so this all is just kind of a slow over time. They kind of develop this image.
Yeah, they were, Bunny, like Bunny says, I was never, his long hair look didn't really work. Bunny had really long hair for a while. And at one point he talks about how he went with Zeno when Zeno went to get his hair dyed, and the girl who was dyeing Zeno's hair begged him to let her cut his hair, and Bunny finally let her. And then he went to a thrift store and got some dress clothes, and yeah, just kind of, because Bunny couldn't really pull off a Steven Tyler look, so he just went in a different direction, which is really the same story with Rick Nielsen. Rick had kind of long hair for a while. There was one point where Rick was wearing that like white jumpsuit that kind of like Pete Townsend used to wear. He wore that for a while. One guy told me, it's actually, I don't think it's in the book, but a guy told me he saw a show where Rick was dressed like a gondola guy from Italy. He tried a lot. He tried different things, but eventually he ends up with this sweater kind of bow tie kind of look. And he's actually wearing that for a while before he starts wearing the hat. And the hat is kind of the last piece of the costume.
Yeah. What's the story behind the hat?
Yeah, well, Brad Elvis, who was in bands at the same time as Cheap Trick and ended up in a band called the Elvis Brothers, who had a couple of records out in the early 80s. But Brad still is a obsessive fan of Cheap Trick. He would go to every show, and he swears that he was at a show, and there's pictures from that show too, where somebody threw a hat on stage, like a tan painter's cap type hat, and Rick put it on. And then the next show Brad saw, Rick was wearing that hat, and then the next show he was wearing a different hat, and then he just kind of always wore a hat after that.
Yeah, he's like Brian Johnson from AC/DC. You never see him without it.
Yeah. And so it kind of sounds insane, the idea of Rick starts wearing a hat because someone threw it on stage. But for one thing, Brad knows the date of this show, and if you look at pictures, there is no picture of Rick wearing a hat before that date. And that was the end of July of 76. And then in August 76, they played a show in Milwaukee where they opened for Peter Frampton. They were on the bill. It was a Peter Frampton, BTO, Gary Wright, and Cheap Trick they weren't even billed. They weren't even on the poster or anything. But at that show, this photographer, Rich Kwasniewski, was there. He sent me maybe 200 pictures he took at that show. And there's pictures with Rick with a hat and without a hat. So even in August of 76, when they opened for Peter Frampton, he was only wearing the hat for part of the show. And what's funny is so they got signed their record deal August 1st. So it would be the end of July that somebody threw the hat on stage. The people from Epic had already come and seen them in June. So when Epic saw them, Rick wasn't wearing a hat. And then when they signed the record deal, somebody had just thrown the hat on stage. It's crazy to think how close it was to when their album came out that he actually started wearing a hat. It was, only a matter of months.
Yeah, he's wearing it on the cover of the first album.
yeah, I mean, he never takes it off eventually. And it's funny, you know, everybody references Hunt's Hall, and it's true that Rick really does have that Hunt's Hall look, and Hunt's Hall would make weird, wacky faces and stuff too. But I think it's interesting that Rick was wearing the sweater and the bow tie look before he was wearing a hat. And then if somebody had just thrown a hat on stage, so Rick wasn't trying to look like Hunt's Hall. It was all just kind of a happy accident, you know?
To me, they look like a group of DJs out of KRP in Cincinnati type of thing, you know? They look more like that, like Robin with he's got the nice vest and the tie. And
it seems like Robin kind of started wearing the dress clothes first, and then Tom eventually kind of took on that same look too.
That's, you know, I love the ironic humor. That's like Frank Beard and ZZ Top. He's the guy without the beard.
Yeah, I mean, when they landed on this, where they had this, you know, the band was these two guys and these two guys, and they're like very different. But yeah, I mean, when they landed on that, and the record label loved that. That's why the record label kind of ran with that when they did the press for the first album. And there was a lot of humor, and that's why that fake biography was written. That's why the record has side A and side 1. The record label, you know, they appreciated the sense of humor and kind of the absurdity of Cheap Trick, and they just ran with it. So that's why the press and the marketing of the first album really focuses on, you know, the uniqueness of the band and the image.
And on that album cover, I'm looking right at it, across the top, that Cheap Trick logo. That's another interesting story. Chris Crow is a guy whose inclusion in your book is much deserved. Before he gets involved, there are 2 early logos, including the toothpaste design that the band hated. If you could tell us who Chris is and how he creates the now iconic Cheap Trick logo.
Yeah, the 2 early logos were designed by a guy named Dave Muldowney, who was a Madison-based like graphic artist that, or just artist that Ken Adamany knew. And Ken Adamany, who was Cheap Trick's manager, he booked a lot of bands. He managed other bands, even though eventually his focus really becomes Cheap Trick. But he used Dave Muldowney for posters and other stuff. But you know, those 2 logos were really unoriginal. And Chris Crow was just a guy. Chris Crow ended up, you know, having a career in Hollywood, working on TV shows and movies. He was just a young guy who was living in Racine, where his dad had a graphic design studio, and he kind of worked for his dad. And but he loved Cheap Trick, and so he decided, since he worked in a graphic design studio, he had this access to the, you know, the materials and the machines and stuff. He decided to try to make a logo for them, and he came up with this crazy thing with that. You know, that's what he made, is with the 6 Cheap Tricks, and he hand set the type and, you know, ran it through these different machines and tried to get it to bleed, and, you know, but he was just inspired by how much he loved the band. So I think that's really a beautiful story, is that, because that is such an amazing logo, and I think it was really important. It just, you know, it really helped make them seem like a real band, because they had this killer logo that was just like not like anything else. And the fact that Chris just designed that just because he loved the band so much and wanted to participate and take part in the creative process, that's basically how he describes it, is like he felt a creative kinship with those guys, and he felt like, well, I have a talent that I could contribute to this. So they had no idea he was even doing it, and he just brought it to his show and handed it to them, and he never has made a cent off of it, and he never wanted to. You know, he just did it out of love for the band and their music and their creativity. And, you know, that's just a great story. And it's just such a cool logo. I mean, it really is an amazing logo. And it sets them apart because it doesn't look like the Kiss logo or the Aerosmith logo. It has a different feel to it, you know, and Cheap Trick had a different feel. They weren't necessarily like Kiss or Aerosmith. There was something different about them. That's why they were able to kind of piggyback onto new wave and stuff. That's why Stiff Records wanted to put out their album, or Bomp Records loved them, or, you know, that's why all the bands in the 90s loved Cheap Trick. They always could kind of straddle the lines between these different genres. And I think the logo is the same way. It doesn't look like a 70s rock logo. it just doesn't look like any other logo. It just gives you a different feeling. You're like, there's something different about this.
What is Rick holding there? It's a photo or an album on that first album cover.
It's a picture of him with an accordion, and Thomas is standing behind him. That picture was taken at his parents' music store by Rich Kwasniewski, who I mentioned, the photographer. Rich Kwasniewski has been incredibly generous. There's a bunch of pictures in the book from Rich. And that photo session, there's a bunch of pictures from that photo session in the book. And since they were at the music store, Rick just picked up that accordion and started performing for Rich. And Rich just started snapping pictures. And then Rick Nielsen just loved that picture. Rich Kwasniewski said he would just carry it around. And so he had it with him at the first album shoot. He sold it on the cover. And Rich Kwasniewski told me that Rick told him at one point, he's like, "Hey, I got your picture on the album cover."
Where is that picture today? Do we know? Does he still have it?
I don't remember if it was at Rick's Picks, the museum exhibit that Rick had like 10 years ago. But Rich sent me like every picture from that photo session and a whole bunch of them in the book. I told the publisher that these pictures were so cool. It was my idea to have that layout where there's just like 6 pictures on each. I think there's 6 pictures on one page and 9 pictures or something on the other. I thought those pictures were so cool that we had to get them in there.
What about the checkerboard pattern? What's the story behind that?
That was a story that I was lucky to even get, because it was just an aside that Joel Danzig mentioned when I was talking to him. So Joel Danzig was Paul Hamer's partner in Hamer Guitars, and Joel is really the guy who built the 12-string bass, the guitar with 5 necks, Rick's guitar, Uncle Dick, all of Rick's, the checkerboard Hamer, all of Rick's special guitars from Hamer. Is pretty much Joel Danzig who was doing that. And so there was Rich Kwasniewski's the photographer too of that Hamer ad. There's an ad that Hamer Guitars put in Guitar Player magazine in 1975, and they used Rick Nielsen as the model for the ad, and he's wearing a Cheap Trick shirt. So his outfit was white pants and a white jacket and the Cheap Trick black and white Cheap Trick shirt. And the ad was going to be in black and white. And so Joel Danzig is looking at this. They were Paul Hamer had a store called Northern Prairie Music in Wilmette, Illinois. That was an instrument store. And this is right when they're launching Hamer guitars, and they're going to put this ad in Guitar Player. And Joel Danzig is looking at this setup where Rick is in all black and white, and Joel has a Flying V bass that he built for himself. He has it sitting over there in the room that's got a checkerboard strap on it. And Joel is like, "Whoa, my checkerboard strap would look really cool in this picture because it's all black and white. Everything's black and white." Which he's looking at the Cheap Trick logo, the shirt, the black shirt with the white logo, and he's like, "Oh, the checkerboard." And so Rick puts that strap on the guitar someone just pointed out to me that the guitar Rick is holding in that picture is actually Martin Barr from Jethro Tull. It's the Hamer they built for him.
Oh, wow.
It's not Rick's Hamer, which I had just assumed it was, but a guitar nerd, because I just did a blog post about that ad with Rich Kwasniewski, of course, sent me all the outtakes from the photo shoot. And somebody pointed out, so I think it's the 4th guitar Hamer built was for Martin Barr and Jethro Tull, and that's the guitar Rick is holding in that ad. But anyways, so Rick puts the checkerboard strap on the guitar for the ad, and then he says to Joel, "Can you get me more of these?" And, because it must have been obvious that the checkerboard, white and black checkerboard, matched up with the white and black of the Cheap Trick logo. And then the checkerboard just becomes like a part of the whole aesthetic of the band. And this is
Rick without his hat in those.
Yeah. That ad at 75. Yeah, he's not. It's before he has any of his look together. And those shirts were a pretty recent thing that they'd gotten those shirts.
Yeah, he's barely recognizable.
Yeah, I mean, that was in Guitar Player in 75. This is when nobody knows who Cheap Trick are outside the Midwest, and he's in Guitar Player wearing the Cheap Trick shirt, so they were kind of managed to, that was a big, like, high profile kind of thing for them at the time to have Rick in Guitar Player magazine like that.
And you say Rick really was the front man. He had that sense of humor. He got the laughs a lot, but not all the time. What's the story about the Cheap Trick Carnival you mentioned in the book?
A Carnival game? Yeah. That's a story they've told. I mean, I have that great exchange between Rick and Steve Jones on Steve Jones's radio show about it. It's basically Rick would invite a female volunteer up from the audience, and he would say he could guess her weight. But the way he would guess her weight was she had to sit on his face. And then he explains to Steve Jones why he stopped doing the Carnival game because of a bad experience.
Wouldn't go over well in these days in the year 2022.
No.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast at gmail.com. Jack Douglas is famous for his work with Aerosmith, but he plays a huge role in Cheap Trick history because he's producing that first album. And there's a story in your book about when he first sees the band perform, somebody spotted him unpacking a metronome and told Jack, "You're not going to need that." Now, a metronome, for those who may not know, it's used to help musicians play rhythms accurately, so just to keep them on time. And he was looking to see how tight the band was, and he found out. I mean, the band was tight. What was his first impression of the band when he saw them?
Yeah, it seems like he really fell in love with them. You know, he was in the middle of producing Rocks at that time, and Ken Adamany had this idea, Cheap Trick's manager, of, because they had been trying and trying. They had a bunch of kind of flirtations with record labels, but they couldn't make it happen. And Ken's idea was, what if we get a producer? What if a producer likes us and he can help? And so somehow he lands on Jack Douglas, obviously just because of the Aerosmith connection, I would think. And he gets a letter to Jack. I have the letter, a carbon copy of the letter in the book. Sends it to Jack, who's staying at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston while he's making Rocks with Aerosmith. And he sends Jack some tapes. Jack listens to him and agrees to come out. They fly him out to Waukesha, Wisconsin, where I grew up, and he comes to the Sunset Bowl. And like I say in the introduction of my book, I was literally across the street at that moment, but I was 2 years old. But I went over to that house with my mom a couple years ago, and if you are in our front yard, the front yard of where we were living at that time, if you walk straight across the street, you were in the parking lot of Sunset Bowl. And that's where Jack came and saw them. And yeah, Ken said he saw Jack with a metronome, and he just went up to him and was like, "You're not going to need that." You know, because by this time, 76, all these guys have been playing in bands for more than a decade. They were playing every night for years, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Because everybody who produces them was like, this is the fastest band. They just come into the studio, hammer it out. They don't need multiple takes. They are tight. You know, they're a machine. And so, yeah, Jack Douglas was very impressed also with the show they put on. He talks about how it was a crazy show at the same time, which, you know, mostly goes to Rick. But yeah, he immediately called up Tom Werman, who was an A&R guy at Epic. So that's how Cheap Trick got signed, is Jack Douglas calls Tom Werman and says, "You got to see these guys." And Tom flies out in May, so maybe like a month and a half later, Tom flies to Quincy, Illinois, and sees them, loves them, and then he, you know, goes back and talks to his boss at Epic, who's Steve Popovich, and then Steve comes out and sees them in June, and then they sign him. So yeah, Jack Douglas is instrumental in the band getting a record deal, and then of course he produces their first album. Record
plant in New York City, which is where Patti Smith was one day when she found out Cheap Trick was going to be put up high on the list of priorities. What happened there? She wasn't happy to see that?
I love that story. That's one of those stories where, you know, when you're doing something like this, the best questions are the ones you don't even know to ask. And you just have to hope that the information comes out, you know, in the process. Because this was a moment where I was on the phone with Bunny Carlos, and I just asked him something like, "What was it like at the record plant? You have any memories of the record plant?" And then he just starts talking about this Patti Smith story that he's probably never even told anyone in 40 years, about how when they walked into the record plant, the receptionist told him, "Oh, we had your picture on the wall, but Patti Smith came in here and tore it off the wall and tore it into a million pieces." And so, it turns out that Jack Douglas had just finished producing her second album, Radio Ethiopia. And she was really hoping that this album was going to be more commercial than her first album and maybe get her on the radio. And when she heard the mix, she was not happy. And she's trying to get in touch with Jack and she can't get in touch with him. And it's probably because he's out in Madison doing pre-production with Cheap Trick. And so she figures out that, probably Patti Smith's point of view is like he rushed mixing her album because he wants to get to work on this next band. And she's pissed off and she can't find him. And one of the places she goes to look for him is the record plant. And of course, he's not there. And then it's probably like she turns around and there's the picture of the band that he's working with now. And she's pissed off and she takes it out on Cheap Trick, Which,
I wonder if they've ever crossed paths since then, she gives him a look.
Yeah.
They're in the same room together. It's like,
she eventually had Because the Night, but Radio Ethiopia was not the breakthrough that she was hoping for.
No. And, it's interesting, though, that debut album from Cheap Trick, Oh Candy was the single off of it, but it wasn't a huge hit. I mean, nowadays it's viewed as a classic, but Jack Douglas, he wanted the songs to be socio-political. He was looking for a certain sound and lyrical theme.
Yeah, it's weird for me to imagine, but the band kind of just left it to Jack. He got to pick which songs they recorded for the album and then which songs went on the album. It really seems like it was 100% Jack Douglas's choice, because like I said, by this time they've got like 50 songs to choose from. They have I Want You to Want Me and Surrender. And then they also have a early version of Dream Police, which was rewritten by the time it comes out. So they don't necessarily have the song that you end up hearing in time for the first album, but they do have I Want You to Want Me and Surrender. They've been playing Surrender live by the time they're recording the first album. That song is ready to go. But Jack doesn't pick I Want You to Want Me and Surrender. Obviously, Jack picks their weirdest, craziest songs, which I love. I mean, the first album is probably my favorite album of all time by anyone, but I don't think anyone else except for Jack Douglas would have made that record. But it's such a great document of the club band that Cheap Trick was. It's because they were a weird kind of punk before punk, metal before metal kind of band in the clubs in the Midwest, playing these crazy songs like The Ballad of Richard Speck and Daddy Should Have Stayed in High School and Hello Kitties. If you imagine a club band in the Midwest playing this stuff, it was pretty wild. And those are the songs he picks for the record. But it ends up being this heavy, crazy album that kind of straddles all these genres. There's the glam rock and the hard rock and the heavy metal and the punk rock and the power pop. It's an amazing thing. I think it's just because it kind of has all the different elements of like 70s rock and stuff that I love are all kind of in there on this album, and just brilliant songs. I think Rick Nielsen's approach to guitar is so cool, and Jack Douglas just lets him run with it. It really feels like Jack tried to get their live show on record. And it's debatable about people who saw them live back then didn't necessarily think the record sounded exactly like their live show, but I think it's pretty close. It's a pretty good approximation of what it was like to go see a Cheap Trick club show back then. So I think it's really wonderful that we have that document, that Jack Douglas got that documented. I don't think I can't imagine another producer that would have given us that album. But at the same time, there's not really a hit single. It's hard to imagine. The record label, I think we're happy with it, but it doesn't come across as a very commercial sounding album.
The socio-political angle, I'm just thinking punk rock, late 70s, New York City. That maybe he was going for that.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what his thought process was, but it's true that he didn't really pick any of their songs that are just like about girls. Most of the songs are have weird topics. You know, the Ballad of Richard Speck, which becomes the Ballad of TV Violence, is about a mass murderer, or in the, like, you don't really get that feel necessarily unless you know that. But yeah, you know, like Taxman, Mr. Thief, or Daddy Should Have Stayed at High School. Yeah, they're very different topics from I Want You to Want Me.
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of murders, they recorded just 15 miles away from where one of the most infamous serial killers lived.
Yeah, and they recorded in between the first two Son of Sam crimes.
Son of Sam.
They were right. Yeah, it was a really weird time in New York City when they went there, which that was one thing I tried to write about at the beginning of that chapter was what exactly New York's, you know, this was the New York City of Death Wish and the Warriors when they went there to record the first album. So
wow, yeah, David Berkowitz, right 15 miles away. Robin Zander laid down his vocals in a matter of days, and he had a great quote you include in the book about his approach to singing and how he's almost playing a role in a film. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, he talks about figuring out, and you hear that I think too. I mean, he takes a different approach to each song, and you know, I would love to know the process of how Rick and Robin work out the melodies and what Rick presents to Robin. You know, Rick's a pretty good singer too. I don't really know exactly what Rick's demo process was at that time, but I would love to know the dynamic of how Rick and Robin, you know, put the melodies together. But, you know, it's true that Robin kind of takes on a different character for each song. He's kind of always done that. So that's why he's called the man of 1,000 voices, because, you know, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to you can't even believe it's the same guy. But, you know, he really, people also, a couple of people mentioned to me about how they felt like when they came back from recording with Jack Douglas, Robin was had even more range, because maybe Jack Douglas pushed him, and because there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of really heavy rock vocals on that first album. But, you know, one thing they did that was cool was they played at Max's Kansas City right before Robin was going to start recording his vocals to kind of warm him up, because that was probably the longest break they had ever taken. You know, there was a couple weeks there where they hadn't played a show because they never, you know, they barely took a night off, let alone a couple weeks. So, yeah, they played that show at Max's Kansas City that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were at so Robin could get warmed up. Actually, it's funny, they had 2 dates booked at Max's, but after the first show, he was ready to go, and they just canceled the other one, and he just did his vocals.
And by the way, his voice is still just as good. You'd know better than me. I mean, I see his Cheap Tricks stuff on YouTube from recent performances, man. I mean, his voice, has he lost any of it? I mean, is he? He's
still great. I mean, I think there's no way to be his age and not have lost at least some.
Yeah.
You know, like, for one thing, they added his son to the band, and his son does backup vocals. It kind of shores things up, you know, at certain points. You know, I remember the first, I don't know what show it was, but I remember very much noticing there's a, like, the bridge, and If You Want My Love keeps going up and up and up. And I remember, I don't know when it was, but there was a moment when I saw them where Robin took that last part down instead of up.
Which is
started doing that.
That's
yeah,
nothing. I mean, he's almost 70.
Yeah, I think
insane.
At the moment I saw him do that, my thought was, wow, he's not invincible. And I mean, he's definitely one of the people from that era who has maintained the most range. And, you know, but yeah, you're not going to be Robin Zander's age, I don't think, and be 100% in terms of that kind of music. But at the same time, Pavarotti was still singing opera until he was really old, right? So,
yeah,
you know, but Robin, I don't think he smokes anymore, but he still smoked up until into the 2000s.
Really? He did? I didn't even know that.
You would see him off to the side of the stage smoking a cigarette sometimes when Rick was out there doing something wacky, you know? Yeah. I used to marvel at that. Like, wow, he smokes too?
What a voice. You did mention the side 1, side A thing, or side 1, side B. What was with that debut? Because that kind of confused people when they bought the album. Is that what happened?
Yeah, people ended up thinking that Hot Love was the first song on the album when Hello Kitties was supposed to be the first song. And that's because everything about the album told people that Hot Love was the first song. It really came down to the layout on the back cover, where if this side is to the left and higher than that side, well, you think that's the first side. And it's just what everybody understood. And also, if you look at the record, the numbers on the record and everything actually indicated, there was an A and a B, even though it says side A and side one, which now there was differing opinions between Ken Adman and Bunny Carlos about whose idea that was, whether it was the record label's idea or the band's idea. I think Bunny said he thought it was the label's idea to do side A and side one, because like I said, the label was having fun with their whole kind of wacky image. But yeah, when they reissued the album in 1998, I talked to Bruce Dickinson, who produced those reissues, and he talked about how he looked at the tapes for the masters, because they would have a master tape for side one and side two of an album, and he's remastering it, so he looks at those boxes and he sent me pictures of them too. I have pictures of those boxes, and the songs are numbered, and Hello Kitties is number 1. That box is numbered 1 through 5, and then you look at the Hot Love box, it's numbered 6 through 10. So that makes it pretty clear that Hello Kitties was track 1. But and I also talked to Paula Scher, who designed the album cover, and I asked her, the band had approval, right? Because if you look at the album cover, it tells you that Hot Love is the first side just because of the layout. And so if the band looked at that, but it's also in that era, it didn't really matter that much. You just put on whatever side of the record. It was different with CDs, where you have track 1 and then you don't have side 2, you just have track 6. That was kind of a different. But when it first came out on CD, it had Hot Love as the first song. It wasn't until 98 that they fixed it and made Hello Kitties the first song. And while I will admit that obviously the band intended for Hello Kitties to be the first song and Ballad of TV Violence to be the last song, I always thought that Hot Love was the first song, and it's hard to just not. In 1998, it was hard to just say, oh well, now Hello Kitties is the first song. I mean, everybody thought Hot Love was the first song.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what it's listed on websites. I'm looking at it right here, Hot Love, first song. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, if you look at the record, and then when it came out on cassette, it actually said side 1 and side 2 on the cassette, and Hot Love said side 1. And then when it first came out at CD in whatever it was, 1991 or something, Hot Love was track 1. But if you look at the master tape boxes, and if you talk to the band, I mean, Bunny's like, well, yeah, it's Hello Kitties, that was the first song, and it really makes sense to have the Ballad of TV Violence be the last song. So in terms of the sequencing, that is it's obvious that's what was intended, but it got confused mainly because it was side A and side 1, and then the way it was laid out on the album definitely gave you the impression. It's
that
hilarious.
Was the Cheap Trick humor kind of backfiring there a little bit, but
yeah, I mean, it's hilarious that there's a debate about what's the first song.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. By the way, Hello Kitties that's one of the best Cheap Trick songs, and it is. Oh. It's got like a double meaning there. It's LO as in hello, but also ELO.
Yeah. Bunny was like, it's not ELO. It's just, there should be an apostrophe. It's just LO. But it's true, they capitalized the ELO on the album. And Rick has, they loved Roy Wood. Rick especially loved Roy Wood, who
the founding member.
He left ELO early on, but definitely they were fans of ELO. And yeah, I maybe that's what they had in mind when they capitalized it like that. Yeah, it was just kind of an homage. Original, like if you look at the master tape boxes that I was talking about, it's actually written HELLO. It's actually written Hello Kitties on there. That's their like glam rock song on there. That's it's like the best Slade song ever. It's so great.
The book is called This Band Has No Past, How Cheap Trick Became Cheap Trick. It is out now through Jawbone Press. The author, Brian J. Kramp, is our guest. In the spring, and we're going to talk about Kiss, too, because there's a little, speaking of nods to bands, we'll get to the nod to Kiss real soon. But going back to spring of 75, the story of Cheap Trick all comes together. According to Bunny, who talked to you a lot for this book, gave you a lot of great information. This is where the band first performed the song that would become their breakthrough hit at a free concert in the park in Rockford on Mother's Day, I Want You to Want Me. Song ended up on the band's second album, 1977's In Color, produced by Tom Werman, who felt the pressure from the record label to come up with the radio single. He heard it as a dance hall tune. So that's why we hear the piano on that original studio track. That's not Rick on guitar?
No, like the solo. Yeah. Jay Graydon, who's like a legendary session guy. Tom brought him in, I guess because of the style of that guitar playing. He either Rick didn't want to do it or wasn't really doing it, or Tom didn't want to bother Rick with it. I don't really know. It's kind of confusing because the band has expressed a lot of, especially Rick and Tom, have had a lot of negative things to say about Tom's approach, especially Tom Werman's approach, especially to that song. If you hear early versions of that, early live performances, and even the version they recorded with Jack Douglas for the first album, the song it's kind of clumsy. I don't know if it really works. I relate to what Tom Werman tried to do with that song because I can hear what he was hearing, and I don't dislike that version of it as much as a lot of Cheap Trick fans do. But also, I think it's important to note that if you hear them play that song live before and after they worked with Werman, obviously, like Tom said, the version on Budokan is a live version of the studio version, and it's really true. The arrangement of the song, they slowed it down, and the Rick plays some of the guitar licks, and I think the whole arrangement of the Budokan version, it's definitely benefited from Tom Werman's version. And so I don't know if the band would really acknowledge that, but I think if you listen to how they played it before and after Werman, they definitely, it kind of helped them figure out a way to present the song live, because it was really kind of this choppy, weird song. It was much faster when they played it in the early days, and I don't think it really necessarily worked. And I think that was Tom Werman's challenge, was that, what do I do with this song? Because it's good, but at the same time, it doesn't quite work the way they do it live. I mean, it must have been really fun to see them play it live, but when you're going to record it for a record, it's kind of a different story, especially with what Tom Werman was trying to go for with that album.
Yeah, Robin Zander said, I don't hate it, but it's not us, the studio version. The live version is us. Yeah.
Tom Peterson hates it. I mean, you can tell that Tom is not. But, if you look at what they were saying back then, they were fine. They weren't saying any of these negative things that they said, 20 years later, like when they re-recorded In Color with Steve Albini and stuff, and they kind of disavowed. If they were so unhappy with In Color, why did they make 2 more albums with Tom Werman? That's what I always say.
Exactly.
If you hated, because I love In Color, I think it's an amazing album. But if they were so upset with how In Color turned out, why would they make Heaven Tonight and Dream Police with the same producer? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
What's interesting about the Kiss connection, too, is just like with Cheap Trick, Kiss had the same thing with Rock and Roll All Night. It's the live version that breaks the band. And same thing with Cheap Trick. And then you got the song Surrender, which is on the band's next album, 1978's Heaven Tonight. It's also got a cover of The Moves' California Man, which I love. The title track, On Top of the World. Surrender, an all-time Cheap Trick classic, and includes the lyric, Then I woke up, Mom and Dad are rolling on the couch, rolling numbers, rock and rolling, got my Kiss records out. Now, Cheap Trick toured with Kiss when Kiss was the biggest band in the world. And the lyric was essentially a thank you to Kiss for their support.
Yeah, probably. And, I point out in the book that because I went to Rick's Picks, that there was a museum exhibit about 10 years ago in Rockford where Rick had all this crazy stuff on display. And one thing he had on display was a lot of handwritten lyrics. And I actually went to Rick's Picks more than once, but I went on the very last day and took pictures of everything, and this was before I was imagining writing a book, but I just, for some reason, I thought, because Rick's Picks was really a cool thing, and I'm really glad I did that, because they had said they were going to come out with a book, but they never did. And so I actually went and took pictures of everything, and in one of my pictures of the handwritten lyrics, you can see this little piece of like a torn off corner of a manila envelope, and it says, got my something records out, and then that is crossed out, and then there's a line and it says kiss. And I was looking at that, I was zooming in, trying to figure out what does it say? What is he crossed out? And then this was years ago, I put it on Facebook. I was like, what does it say? And somebody, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was right now, but they said queen. And then if you look at it, you can totally see there's a Q. I think it said got my Queen records out, then he crossed it out and wrote kiss, which makes sense because they opened for Queen in January of 77, right before or December of 77, right before their first album came out. They opened for Queen, a couple shows for Queen. And it makes sense, but then it also such a better choice for it to be Kiss at the same time, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a great story that Bunny tells you about almost putting the Catman makeup on to step in for Peter Criss. Because Peter
was at the Forum.
Peter was dabbling in the drugs and alcohol a little too much this night.
Yeah, I think Lydia, Chris's wife, says he wasn't familiar with the drug that he took or something like that. A lot of that comes from the book Kiss Alive Forever, that Kurt Gooch and can't remember the other guy's name put up. That's a really cool book, Kiss Alive Forever. And a lot of that story comes from that book about how, Peter was incapacitated to the point where Gene came and told Buddy, we might need you. And Buddy was like, what the hell, I'll do it. But they managed to, I don't know, I think they gave Peter a shot of something. And then the drum tech actually had to like sit behind Peter to prop him up and stuff. But Peter managed to get through this show. It's funny because I also heard a story from Paul Taylor from Winger, who played with Aldo Nova when they were on tour with Cheap Trick in the early 80s, and Saxon were on that tour. And there was a night where something was up with the Saxon drummer, and Buddy was going to play with Saxon. And then that didn't happen at the last minute too. Like the guy managed to pull it together or something. But the idea of Bunny Carlos playing with Saxon is pretty hilarious.
Oh, yeah. And him in Catman makeup would be absolutely priceless. Yeah. I guess
would be legend. That would be so legendary if there were pictures of that show where Bunny played as Peter.
Oh, man. Is the line about catching mom and dad rolling on the couch autobiographical?
Yeah, that was a thing where there's this guy, Hank Ransom, like I talked about earlier about how they were out in Philadelphia. And when they were out in Philly in the early 70s, originally it was just Rick and Stookie that moved out there. And they started working at this club called Artemis. And they met Hank Ransom there. And Hank was a drummer. He had a band called Good God, who actually had an album out on Atlantic, kind of like a prog band. Hank had a twin brother named John who played bass in Good God. And so that was the rhythm section for Rick and Stookie for a while, was Hank and John. And there's actually some recordings out there. They ended up on a Naz bootleg. They recorded these songs. They were trying to get a deal with Columbia. And actually, Ira Robbins had some great interviews that he did in the 90s when he wrote the liner notes for the Cheap Trick box set. And they talked about how actually what they were recording there was supposed to be like a Stookie solo thing. They weren't actually calling it Sick Man of Europe yet. But it's interesting because the songs they did were Rick Nielsen wrote the songs, but it was like they were trying to get a record deal for Stookie. And so Hank and John were playing with them, but Hank and John had their own band. They had to go on tour. Like Hank said, when they went to Columbia, he had to lie about his name because he was under contract with Atlantic. But anyways, all of this to say, Hank Ransom, they knew him. And then when Bunny fell and broke his arm in 1976, they brought Hank out to fill in for Bunny, even though they ended up making Bunny play one-armed and they had two drummers for a while. But they brought Hank out, and that was when Surrender, they were working on Surrender. Like there's a recording of them playing Surrender in May of 76. Hank came out in June. Rick is still kind of finishing up the lyrics of Surrender, and Bunny told me that so I had talked to Hank Ransom, and Hank had told me Surrender's about his daughter. He's like, Surrender's about Heather. That's Heather's song. So I asked Bunny about that. I was like, Hank says that Surrender's about Heather. And then Bunny's like, yeah, I remember we were all at rehearsal. This was in 76. And we were talking about that time back in Philadelphia when Heather walked in on her parents doing the deed. And I have to say that was not the part of Surrender that I was thinking was about, that Hank was saying the song's about Heather. That was really the part I was thinking about. But that's what Buddy remembers. But I talked to Heather Ransom too, and she had a lot of cool things to say about that song because she always related. She talked about how her parents were weird, and so she related to that. Mommy's all right, Daddy's all right. They just seem a little weird because she grew up with these parents that were like in the band rock and roll community. They had all these friends. It wasn't like the other kids at her school. Her parents were different. And so she always related to that part of the song too. So I think that's a pretty cool part of the book where Heather talks about what the song meant to her. But at the same time, if Heather's in the song, it's probably the part about rolling on the couch, which there's an early version of that song where that couplet is very different. Something about daddy barking like a hound dog. I think he's going to pounce or something.
Oh my God.
It talks about mom being naked on the couch and daddy barking like a hound. So there's a very different version of that I guess was more about Hank and his wife than even because by the end, I say in the book, I think they're talking about the parents rating more than just the stash of records. We're talking about rolling numbers, I think. So he rejiggered it and it went through different permutations of that concept.
That's great. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Booked on Rock is online.
Woo! Awesome!
Go to bookedonrock.com to listen in, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. Find out the latest books on rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And I've added a blog to the website. Do a guy a favor, huh? Give it a read. I talk to myself enough. I don't want to write to myself.
Oh, boy. He's cracked.
That's bookedonrock.com. Cheap Trick at Budokan busts that band wide open. That's still their best-selling recording. And then they go on to record the next studio album, which is Dream Police 1979. And here we go now. It's just only up from here, man. They became one of the biggest bands by the end of the decade. The title track, Voices. There was a bit of a decline by the mid-'80s, but as we know, that changes with the platinum-selling Lap of Luxury 1988 featuring The Flame and their cover of Elvis Presley's Don't Be Cruel. So a total of 20 studio albums, 8 live albums, 17 compilation albums, 65 singles in all. What is your personal favorite Cheap Trick song?
Picking one song is not easy.
No.
You mentioned that Top of the World earlier. I think that is one of the greatest examples of the brilliance of Cheap Trick. That song is pretty mind-blowing. Kind of has all the elements, but it also kind of transcends. I mean, I don't know what I would say is my favorite, but a song like On Top of the World is pretty much as good as it gets,
Hard to argue. And that's the thing about Cheap Trick. I don't know if there's a band out there who has a better sense of melody and hooks. What's the songwriting process there? Who comes up with the music? How does it all develop into what we hear? Because to this day, these songs are still, even the new stuff they put out, it's great.
Yeah. Early on, it was mostly Rick. They started collaborating more. And I think these days, their more recent albums is mostly collaboration. It doesn't seem like you get any songs anymore that are just written 100% by Rick. Even into the 2000s, like an album like Rockford Rockford is one of my favorites, and that from 2006. I think there's a lot of Rick on that, but their most recent albums have been a lot of collaboration, I think. But I think, especially in the early years, Rick Nielsen was the mad genius of the band and the main songwriter. And yeah, he really had a knack for melody. And then Robin Zander, just took those melodies to the next level. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how I think Rick Nielsen's approach to the guitar was different. And I think he just used it as a vehicle for songwriting more than anything. And I think that really informed the way he wrote songs, was that his approach to guitar was different. He was never a virtuoso kind of, guitar god. It was really more about the songs and the riffs for Rick. And I think he developed his own style, because I really don't think he ever even aspired to be like an Eric Clapton or an Eddie Van Halen or anything. I think for Rick, it was always more about the songs than about the guitar playing. But, the songs revolve around the guitar and what he does with the guitar. But like I have in the book where he talks about being influenced by Spike Jones's, the saxophone on Spike Jones records and stuff like that. Like, I think he had a different set of influences, and he's coming from a different place with the guitar and with songwriting. And I think it's really special. And I think he's a genius. I think he really found it in like 75, 76, when he got Robin in the band, and he really figured out his kind of own approach and his own style. And it was just really special. But, they ended up in the 80s with the record label and outside writers, and he still got a lot of brilliant material from Rick. And Robin and Tom have participated in plenty of the songwriting. A song like Never Had a Lot to Lose, I think that was written mostly by Robin and Tom. So, and that's a great song from Lap of Luxury. I Can't Take It is a great song, mostly written by Robin. So Robin and Tom have had their moments, but really, like I said, the mad genius behind Cheap Trick has always been Rick Nielsen. It's mostly been his vision, and it's a great vision. So
the band parted ways with Bunny Carlos as a performer in 2010 until Rick Nielsen's son Dax took over on drums. Things got ugly there with the legal battles between the band and Bunny at one point, but he was there when the band got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which in 2016, which was really cool. So things pretty good with him and the guys in the band. I mean, they got to communicate with business decisions, or what's going on with that?
I don't think they really have any communication, probably. I don't really know what the dynamic is anymore. Yeah, when it originally happened, when you built basically a corporation by that point for 40 years, you can't just say to one of the guys, you're out, because he owns 25% of what is Cheap Trick. And they can't just say you're gone, because he owns 25. Either they have to buy his 25% from him, or he still owns 25%, no matter what. So they were in this situation where they wanted Bunny out. Bunny's like, I'm not leaving. And they ended up, so that's why there was a period of time where they could not record new music without Bunny, because they had it was in their contract or whatever. Bunny could keep them from making any new music. So eventually, and I think that's why the lawsuits happened, because it was the only way they were going to work it out where they could make a new record, was I think they stopped paying Bunny. My speculation is it was all planned. They were like, we got to get this into court so we can make a new album. So they stopped paying Bunny so he would sue them. They countersued. This was their way to at least figure it out enough that they could continue making albums, because Bunny was keeping them from even making a new album.
Yeah, the last one he's on is 09's the latest. I think he's on that one, right? And then it's another 7 years before they come back with a new album.
Yeah, because Bunny, he didn't want to leave the band. And so since he did not want them to make new music without him, which is understandable. But eventually, they wanted to continue on without him. And I think the only way to do it was, unfortunately, through the courts. But like you said, they're the only band that had drama that have ever gone to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, put it all aside, been cordial, and performed together. There's not another band, like Van Halen or Kiss.
Oh, that was a disaster.
Kiss refused to perform. Blondie was a disaster, where Frank and Nigel, I think it was those two that went up there and were talking about they won't let us play. Yeah, every band that has had any drama, it's been a disaster at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But Cheap Trick, even though they had a lot of drama at the time, they went there, they played nice, they played together, and it was great. And they're the only band that have done it, I think, that have that.
Steve Perry didn't perform with Journey. He was there.
Right. Yeah, and it's been really sad. Like when Kiss just refused to play was so disappointing. Yep. So I'm so grateful that Cheap Trick were the ones who could just go there and because it was so great when they got in, because that was the first time they were ever nominated. They got in right away, and who's more deserving? People have their opinions on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, obviously, it's really ridiculous, the list of bands that aren't in there, and they're always in such a rush to put the new bands in that as soon as they become eligible, it's like Green Day could wait 5 years while you induct Thin Lizzy and Badfinger. I mean, it doesn't make a lot. It's stupid, but it was also for a band like Cheap Trick or who are maybe kind of the underdogs, and they're like the band's band. They're like so respected by a lot of the other people who are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a great thing to see them get in and to see them be able to go there as the core 4 members and play together for one last time, probably.
Yeah, that was awesome.
So,
and Bunny did perform, and he seemed to be performing just fine. But what you hear in the media may not always be true. But I heard things about they weren't happy with the set list he was coming up with because he was the go-to guy for the set list, and then they weren't happy with his performance, especially out on tour night after night.
Yeah, I think that's just the official story. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think it's out there now that there was a serious falling out between Robin and Bunny to the point that Robin said it's him or me. So it's pretty obvious who's going to win out in that battle, because you can't have Cheap Trick without Robin. I mean, many would argue that you can't have Cheap Trick without Bunny, and I can see their point of view. But you really, even though we've seen them play Cheap Trick shows without Rick, that's hard for me to. I wouldn't be too happy if I went to see Cheap Trick and Rick wasn't there. Recently Rick sprained his ankle really bad, and instead of cancel the shows, they played him, and I can see their point of view. I can also see the point of view of a fan who would not be happy about that. But yeah,
though, sadly, there's a lot of people there who wouldn't even know the difference. That always bums me out. Oh, it's Cheap Trick. They don't even know who's in the band,
I always wonder how many people are in a Kiss crowd who don't even know that's not Ace and Peter, and
absolutely.
It's probably a lot more than I could even imagine.
Ace who? Yeah. Who's it? Ace Peter who? Oh, well, let me explain to you, son. Many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll wrap up with this then. So the band is still going, and you quote Robin in the book from the Rock Hall ceremonies. He said, "You can write retirement on my tombstone." So I don't think they're going to, I think they're going to be the ones that they're just going to go right until they can't go anymore. So what do you think of the band these days, and what are you looking forward to from these guys?
I'll go see them any chance I get. The last time I saw them was a little over a year ago on July 4th. It was weird. It was that time right when everybody stopped wearing masks, and we thought we were past the pandemic, but then it came back within a couple of weeks. But that was like the first time I had gone out in a crowd where nobody was wearing masks, and we all thought it's over. And yeah, I mean, I love seeing them still. What I did notice at that show is when Rick came out with the 5-neck guitar, he just had to go over and lean on the drum riser, and eventually he just bent over and like put the guitar on the stage. I think Rick is going to have to retire that 5-neck pretty soon, because that thing is heavy. And so he's still trying to do it, but I can remember the days when Rick would lift that thing over his head. We're not going to see, I don't know.
He's got to take the Angus Young approach. Angus, he picked the guitar that he uses, the Gibson, because it's so light. He's got to he's got money. They can develop a lighter. What is it, like this? The 6 guitars all in one, or whatever that thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's got every neck on that thing. Every neck on that thing works. Maybe he's just gonna have to have a 5-neck built that's really only one guitar. The rest of it's hollow and fake.
Yeah,
yeah.
The book is out now. This Band Has No Past: How Cheap Trick Became Cheap Trick. It's out through Jawbone Press. Available wherever books are sold, but this is your chance, Brian, to plug any websites or social media pages, and we want to mention your podcast again, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, I have a blog where I've been sharing a lot of cool stuff, old rare pictures that nobody's ever seen. I have this, for example, Ken Adamany let me bring home. He still has, so he was their manager from the beginning, and he was a booking agent in the 60s. He was associated with Rick and Bunny and Tom in the 60s. So he had this questionnaire that he would ask people to fill out for his booking agency or whatever. And it's yellow paper. It's the original document that Rick Nielsen wrote on with a ballpoint pen in 1967. He let me bring that home and scan it. And so I put stuff like that on my blog. So there, and if you just go to thisbandhasnopast.com, it takes you to the blog. And I've been, as it's been ramping up to the book coming out, I've been sharing more and more of kind of the rare stuff, the pictures that nobody's ever really seen before, and just trying to, get the enthusiasm going for the book. So there's the blog for the book, and my podcast is called Rock and or Roll. Recently came up with an episode where I played a bunch of clips from the interviews that I did for the book. So I think that's a pretty kind of a one-of-a-kind episode. You don't really get to hear some of the actual quotes from the book. You get to hear them, but it's a lot of stuff that isn't in the book necessarily or quoted directly in the book. But it's pretty interesting, I think, to hear all those interviews with all the different characters from the story. Even Bunny, I had a 3.5-hour meeting years ago with Ken Adamany and Bunny Carlos that I recorded, and Ken and Bunny even let me use some clips from that, so you get to hear me talking to Ken and Bunny too.
Oh, that's
so
awesome.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
so that's on Rock and or Roll. I'm part of the Pantheon podcast network.
Thanks so much, man. This was an awesome interview. This is the first episode I've done on Cheap Trick. I really enjoyed it. I'm a huge Cheap Trick fan, so I really appreciate you being here, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Just anything to get the word out about the book. I'm really proud of it. I think even if people aren't huge Cheap Trick fans, will just love this kind of universal tale of these four. Like you said, 2/3 of every American male under the age 23 was in a band, but very few of them stuck it out and made it their career because they were talented enough and dedicated enough. And so that's kind of what this story is.
And it's a great story. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
That'll do it for this episode. Looking forward to having you back again next time for the next brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.